So thank you all so much for coming today. Welcome to Explorations in Archaeology. My name is Layla Joyce. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Kansas. And my co-organizer, Beth Potter, is also. We are really excited to have you with us today and to have Dr. Katherine Pompeani, who will be giving us a talk on her work on the Maros culture. So before I introduce Dr. Pompeani, let's do a couple quick housekeeping things. So as we go through the presentation, please enter whatever questions you have in the chat. We'll go through the chat later on and present those questions to Dr. Pompeani for her to answer. Once we've gotten through all the questions in the chat, you'll have a chance to unmute yourself and ask questions directly. And we'll ask that you stay muted and keep your video off for the presentation itself, just to keep things a little bit smoother overall. And but once we're into asking questions and have gone through the chat questions, feel free to unmute and turn your video on if you like to chat with Dr. Pompeani. So Dr. Katherine Pompeani is an anthropology instructor at Kansas State University. She's worked in Serbia, North Macedonia, Hungary, New York, and Kansas. Her talk focuses on the people who lived and died over 3,500 years ago in what is now northeastern Serbia. Known as the Maros culture, these farmers and herders left no written records. Dr. Pompeani will present her research on what Maros skeletal remains can tell us about how people lived, what they ate, and how they died. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pompeani.
All right, hello everyone. And wait till it switches over. And so this is kind of a larger summary of what was my dissertation research. And so this is based on a much larger piece of work. And I'm gonna kind of go through some of the major sections and the major findings. And an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today is starting off with what is bioarchaeology. So I identify as a bioarchaeologist, and I've, as Layla mentioned, I've worked both in North America and over in Europe, and specifically in Serbia, North Macedonia, and Hungary. But the focus of my dissertation was bioarchaeological analysis of human remains from a early to middle Bronze Age cemetery located in what is today northeastern Serbia. It's a bit of a mouthful, but there it is. I'll go into who were the Maros, introduce my research questions, and then there's 3 topical areas that I'm going to focus on. The first is childhood health, mortality, and longevity. The second are connections between gender, status, and violence. And the third is diet and life history. And then I'll wrap up with a conclusion with looking at, okay, what does the skeletal evidence in the context of the archaeological evidence tell us about these 3 research areas, and what can we say about how these people lived and how they died and how these 2 things are connected. So starting off, bioarchaeology is the application of archaeological theory to the study of human skeletal remains. In my research, I was interested in what bioarchaeology could tell us about social dynamics at the local level in the Bronze Age of the Carpathian Basin. So we kind of have 3 different levels. At the largest, we have the super regional level, and this is Central Europe. And then within Central Europe, we're looking at a specific area known as the Carpathian Basin, and then within the Carpathian Basin, an area known as the Pannonian Plain. It's also known as the Great Hungarian Plain. And I have a map on the next slide, and you can orient yourself with that. And then within the regional level, the local level. And at the local level with the Maros culture, we distinguish between 2 Maros sites, Maros villages and Maros cemeteries. So in my research, I was interested in what bioarchaeology could tell us about social dynamics at the local level during the Bronze Age in the Carpathian Basin, and looking at these social dynamics as insight into how communities participate in and adapt to shifts in their larger political, social, and economic circumstances. In doing so, I adopted a biocultural approach, which examines population level changes in demography and health as a product of human behavior, biology, and culture, and how these human behavior, biology, and culture are affected by their physical environment. My data collection included analysis of human skeletal remains for signs of disease and trauma in the population from the Bronze Age cemetery at a site known as Ostojcevo. And finally, my analysis placed demography, health, and diet in the context of the human life course as with the idea that our lives are shaped not just by our biology, but more importantly, by our cultural experiences. And these continue to have and do have a measurable impact on our bodies from even before we're born to when we die. So for example, how does susceptibility to disease vary over someone's lifetime? So disease tends to accumulate with age. The effects of early childhood health and nutrition can impact someone's likelihood of developing a disease and dying at a younger age later on. What role does gender and status play in influencing health and longevity? And how do cultural beliefs and practices related to pregnancy and childcare affect maternal health? In addition to these three, bioarchaeology adds a fourth dimension to archaeological research on Bronze Age cultures in the Carpathian Basin. And so when we are looking at kind of traditional archaeological deposits, it's really hard to get, it's difficult to get at the individual because in general, you're looking at artifacts that have accumulated over years, sometimes even over generations. So you're kind of looking at things in the collective sense. But when we talk about communities, within communities, the individual constitutes the basic unit of social life. By taking a bioarchaeological approach that runs kind of parallel to the archaeological perspective and borrows a lot from the archaeological point of view, I'm able to kind of move between the levels of the individual, community, and the population, kind of scaling things up or down depending on the questions I ask or the types of methods that I use. So background to the Maros. So here's the map. This is the Carpathian Basin. You see you have Hungary, Romania, and then Serbia down here. And the Maros sites are found in the southeast corner of the Carpathian Basin in the southernmost area of the Pannonian Plain. So you see the Great Hungarian Plain, the Pannonian Plain, and we're at the kind of the southern part of it. This area is defined by the Maros River to the north and by the Tisa River to the south. So the Maros River flows out of the Carpathian Mountains into the Pannonian, into the Carpathian Basin in the Pannonian Plain, and then it'll meet up with the Tisa River, which then eventually flows into the Danube. Today, this region encompasses parts of Hungary, Romania, and Serbia. In the past, this area would have been a mosaic of permanent and seasonal wetland, grassland, and riparian forest. Major waterways such as the Maros River and the Tisa River and their tributaries served as important transport routes, connecting people with the Pannonian Plain, connecting people in the Pannonian Plain and the larger Carpathian Basin with groups and especially raw materials in the mountains, in the Carpathian Mountains and in the Apuseni Mountains. Raw materials such as metal, copper, tin, and gold, and stone like flint and soapstone, as well as salt, were not available locally in the Pannonian Plain. These needed to be brought into the area either through direct transport or through trade, through exchange. As you can see here, the Maros area, the Maros region, was strategically located at a major point of entry for the movement of these exotic materials into the Pannonian Plain, and then allowing for their distribution throughout the larger Carpathian Basin. So we're kind of talking about things happening at different levels here, at the local level, and then how that's connected to things happening at the regional level. Radiocarbon dating of several Marsh settlements and cemeteries, including Ostoychevo, distinguishes between two phases. So here we have just the very general breakdown, and this is in years BC of the Bronze Age in this area. So the sites we're talking about span the early and middle Bronze Age, but within the Maros region, we have a further distinction between early Maros and late Maros sites, with some sites spanning and either having occupation or activity in both the early and the late Maros phases. So what are the distinctions between an early versus a late Maros site, apart from how old it is? Well, the early Maros period starts at kind of the beginning of the Bronze Age in this area. And it's characterized by the abandonment of Copper Age villages, which tended to be pretty small, and the reemergence of large settlements, which were often guarded by a ditch and or a wooden palisade wall, though a large segment of the population lived outside of these large settlements in what we would consider open or undefended villages. Villages were politically autonomous, and they were integrated through shared cultural traditions and family ties. Within villages, people tended to live in small single-family households. In terms of the economy in the early Maros area, long-distance trade relations allowed for the flow of exotic goods, like metals, like stone, like salt, from the Carpathian and Apuseni Mountains into the Pannonian Plain. At this time, you also have a local economy involved in raising livestock, agriculture, and ceramic production. In the late Maros phase, after about 1800 BC especially, there's an increased emphasis on the local kind of homegrown economies. And this potentially reflects a breakdown in longstanding trade relations that allowed for people living in the Maros area to have privileged access to goods in the form of raw materials and finished objects. Homegrown economic activity that's happening in the late Maros period includes the production of these highly decorative and ornate, polished Baroque vessels. There's also some indication in the late Maros period of increasingly specialized livestock husbandry focused on sheep and goats raised for wool production. Pardon me. Most Maros sites are abandoned by about 1500 BC, with the Maros area largely depopulated until the end of the late Bronze Age, beginning of the Iron Age around 800 BCE. So this area seems to be kind of mostly depopulated for several hundred years, for several centuries, after being pretty intensively inhabited for over 1,000 years. So looking at Ostoychevo, most Maros sites cluster around the confluence of the Maros River here and then the Tiza River. Maros cemeteries, which are the blue triangles, the cemeteries are the red circles, the settlements are the blue triangles. And you can see in a lot of these areas that they're kind of paired. So you usually have one or more cemetery associated with a settlement, and they're usually no more than a couple kilometers from each other. The area that we are looking at and the two most well-documented Maros cemeteries are located in Serbia. And this includes the early Maros cemetery at Mokran and the late Maros cemetery at Ostoychevo. So radiocarbon dates from Mokran place the use of this cemetery between about 2100 to 1800 BC, and the use of Ostoychevo spans from about 1930 to 1550 BCE. So there may be some overlap in the two use of the cemeteries very early on, but Mokran dates to this late Maros period, to the early Maros period phase, whereas Ostoychevo dates to this late Maros phase. There have been no associated settlements found near Ostojicevo. So we don't actually know where the people buried at Ostojicevo lived. We haven't found anything like that. So Yugoslav archaeologists between 1981 and 1991 excavated 285 graves at Ostojicevo. So this is a map of the cemetery with each dot representing a separate grave, and then the line around it is the boundaries of the excavation. Of these graves, most people were buried on their sides with their bodies flexed at their knees and at their elbows. The majority of graves are inhumations, which means it's just a simple burial. And 64% of all graves are inhumations. 34% of graves are urn inhumations. So the majority of children who died under the age of 5 were buried in this kind of flexed position on their side, but they were buried in these large storage urns. So they were buried in the same way as older children and adults, but they were just placed in this container in this storage urn. And so about a third of all graves are these urn inhumations. And you have a couple of cremations, and I believe there's a single cenotaph, which is a symbolic grave. So it's a grave where you have grave goods, but there's no body. Excluding the urn burials, 71% of graves have at least one grave offering, with a small ceramic cup, the most common type of grave offering. And here are some examples of grave offerings. They range from very basic to some of these more elaborate grave offerings. So these are either beaded necklaces or beaded belts made out of stone or bone and animal bone and teeth beads. And then you have these copper beads that were probably sewn onto some type of a headdress or some type of a garment that people would have worn. But that's since decomposed and unable to recover archaeologically. Grave and body orientation was really important to the Marosh, and it conveyed a sense of duality tied to gender identity. Directions here indicate the position of the head in relation to the body, and this includes both inhumations and urn inhumations. So north and south were the most common head positions, with east and west being less common. And these are going to come up again because this is important, especially when we're looking at demography and how we can create models of demographics in terms of how old people are when they're dying, and if there's any differences between males and females in terms of their age at death and patterns of death. So my research focused on 3 main questions that looked at the analysis of health, trauma, and diet in human skeletal remains from Ostojicevo. So the first question is, how did changes in regional trade and political and social organization affect local populations in terms of demography, health, and diet? My second question is, what was the biocultural impact of increasing social complexity and social inequality on violence? What was the pattern and incidence of violent conflict in the population buried at Ostojicevo? And third, how did fertility and childcare practices affect patterns of morbidity and mortality in infants, children's, adolescents, and young adults? In addressing these questions, I focused on 3 key areas of bioarchaeological analysis. The first is early childhood health and how that impacted mortality and longevity in adolescence and adulthood. Is there any relationship between gender, social status, and violence, signs of violence in human remains? And when we look at diet in the context of life history, what can that tell us about how gender and social roles may have affected how people lived and even their well-being? So we're going to start off with looking at early childhood health, mortality, and longevity. And falls into the category of demographic analysis. And demographic analysis addresses three key questions. The first is, who was the most likely to die in childhood? Were males or females more likely to die in childhood? Who was more likely to survive to adulthood? And how did exposure to disease and stress in early childhood affect morbidity and mortality in adulthood? To investigate these questions, I needed to determine when people were at the greatest risk of death. However, there is a problem. Biological sex cannot be determined from skeletal analysis of individuals who were under 18 years when they died. So I cannot determine whether someone was likely a male or a female based on their remains if they died before they were 18. So my solution was Archaeological, as at all marrow cemeteries for which we have skeletal and mortuary data, there is a strong correlation between body position in terms of head location and biological sex. And we see that here at Archaeological, where 77% of individuals identified as biological males were buried with their heads either to the north or the east, whereas 85% of individuals identified as biological females were buried with their heads to the south or the west. And this treatment, in terms of the body position, extended to infants, children, and adolescents. So for demographic analysis, I inferred the sex, I'm using air quotes here, of individuals younger than 18 years based on their body orientation. And so this is what it looks like. On the x-axis here, we have the different age categories. On the y-axis to the right, this is the percentage of males in the blue and females in the red dying at each age category. And on the y-axis to the right, I think I just mixed up my left and rights there. Anyways, the y-axis here, this QX variable, this is the probability of death for males and females in each age category. So what we have here is that there's no difference in the probability of death between males and females under 10 years, and that the lines are kind of pretty close to one another. However, these two lines, the lighter gray are probability of death for females, the black line is the probability of death in males, start to diverge in adolescence. So the probability of dying in females kind of plateaus during adolescence and through their 20s up to 30 years. And it doesn't start increasing until after 30 years in females. For males, there is a slight increase in adolescence in terms of probability of death, but then we see a very steep increase in the probability of death among males in their 20s and 30s, with most males dying in their 30s and 40s, and very few males, only 3% of the male sample surviving past 50, compared to about 10% of all females surviving to ages older than 50 years. So this data supports differences in mortality between males and females. These differences, however, emerged in adulthood with no evidence of a mismatch in pre-adolescent mortality patterns between males and females. And we also see longevity as something being more common in females compared to their male counterparts. So if there's no difference in mortality between males and females prior to kind of their mid-teens, what about their health? Do we see any differences in their health? And is there evidence that males dying in their 20s and 30s were somehow less healthy than age-matched females, which would explain why their probability of death in these age classes just rises really steeply? To examine this, or to address this, I examined several stress markers, but for the sake of time and simplicity, I'll focus on a single marker, cribroorbitalia. So these are the eye sockets, and these are the roofs, the tops of the eye sockets, so kind of right there. And Cribororbitalia, which I abbreviate as CO, can be identified by looking for the presence of small or large pores on the roofs of the eye sockets. And this type of porosity results or is a result of the malabsorption of vitamins and minerals caused either by an underlying illness, such as a parasitic infection, or a viral or a bacterial infection, or a dietary deficiency like iron or B12. And when I assessed porosity, I not only looked for the presence or absence of Cribororbitalia in the eye sockets, um, and this is just pointing out what I'm actually looking at here. I also assessed porosity based on activity, whether it was severe or mild, and whether this porosity was active or remodeled, being healed, being that this individual was no longer experiencing this health crisis at the time that they died. So these are 3 examples, and this is the age of the individuals in each of the examples, and showing what I would define as a severe case versus a mild case, and then what it would look like for an active versus a remodeled or healed porosity. So looking at the results here, we have the male prevalence on the left. So at the x-axis, we have the age categories. The y-axis is the percentage of individuals affected in each of these age categories. Males on the left and females on the right. And the dark part of the bars is of the percentage of individuals affected, what is the proportion of these that had active lesions at the time of death versus what is the proportion that had remodeled or healed lesions at the time of death. So starting with looking at males, there are almost no, or there are no individuals with active lesions after 20 years. So you have quite a few of individuals dying between 20 to 40 years who have signs of Cribororbitalia, but they're almost all remodeled, suggesting that whatever was causing this wasn't active at the time of death, that they had survived whatever the stressor was. And there were no cases of Cribororbitalia in males older than 40 years at their time of death. So what this tells me, or what this told me, is that males who experienced and survived early childhood stress were, many of them did survive to adulthood. So this pattern suggests that actually males may have been relatively healthier as children, that they were able to survive stress, to survive severe health insults as children. However, these male survivors seem to be predisposed to an early death as adults. Looking over here at the female pattern, there are fewer females with skeletal markers of early childhood stress surviving to adulthood. And what this tells me is that the females that are dying at younger ages, they're dying more quickly. They're succumbing to diseases earlier in the stage of the disease rather than experiencing the chronic effects where it then can affect their bones. Additionally, about 7.5% or 7.5% of women dying between 20 and 40 years, which would kind of correspond to their peak reproductive years, exhibit active Cribororbitalia. So what's happening in these women is there's probably a compound effect of early childhood stress plus continued stress in adulthood, likely associated with anemia and blood loss during pregnancy and childbirth. When we compare the overall prevalence of Cribororbitalia between males and females under 20 and males and females over 20, there's no significant difference. That males and females are similarly affected by Cribororbitalia. However, when we look at these patterns, especially in terms of the distribution of active and remodeled lesions relative to age and sex, we do see age-related trends that indicate that males were more likely to survive periods of prolonged childhood stress. However, this had a negative effect on male survivorship in their 20s and 30s. However, females surviving past 20 years seem to be, on average, healthier than their male counterparts, and that they were even able to maybe survive for a period of time, additional health insults as an adult. So there seems to be this kind of trade-off between males maybe having healthier childhoods, but then that negatively affecting their mortality as an adult, whereas females may have been more likely to succumb to stress as children, which then in turn meant that relatively healthier females were the ones that were surviving to adulthood. And this allowed them to be better able to survive disease and survive malnutrition and even survive pregnancy as adults. So early childhood stress and how it affects longevity accounts for higher male mortality between 20 and 40 years. However, it doesn't explain everything. So what else, other than general kind of non-specific morbidity, could cause higher mortality rates among young adult males? And for this, I focused on trauma, and specifically trauma linked to interpersonal violence. So violence and conflict are influenced by technology and culture. In the Bronze Age, conflict would have included hand-to-hand combat, possibly with the use of axes, stone, copper, bronze daggers, stone projectiles, or wrestling or fist fighting. So the types of injuries that are associated with these types of activities, these types of violent activities, include sharp or blunt force trauma that target the head, injuries to the upper body, especially the limbs, the upper limbs and torso. For example, a transverse fracture of the midshaft of the ulna, known as a perifracture. So you have the ulna, which is the kind of inner bone in the forearm. And if you go to block a blow, where's it going to hit? It's going to hit the shaft of your ulna. And that direct impact will then cause a transverse injury. And that's colloquially known as a perifracture. Also, types of injuries associated with fighting with interpersonal violence include hand fractures. So a boxer's fracture is a fracture to the neck of the fifth metacarpal. So that would be this bone here, the bone in your hand just below your pinky bone, and it would have a comminuted fracture to this right here from punching, rib injuries, and also looking for multiple injuries that may indicate injury recidivism, especially multiple injuries that are at different stages of healing, which would indicate they were caused by separate events. Now, if you have multiple injuries and they're all at a similar kind of stage of healing, that would probably tell you that these injuries occurred at the same time. But if you have a healed injury and then one that was in the process of healing or that was fresh at the time of death, tells you that this individual experienced trauma at different points and that these incidents probably weren't related to one another. Finally, the age of the person needs to be taken into account in determining whether an injury is due to violent causes or accidental causes. So injuries accumulate with age. Those multiple injuries in a younger individual would be more unexpected than if you saw multiple injuries in an older person, unless that younger person was involved in some type of activity that placed them at a higher risk of injury, either due to violence or accidental causes. So here we have injuries associated with violence, accidental or an unknown mechanism, and whether they are single or multiple, and then the number of individuals affected. So overall, 31 individuals exhibited signs of trauma. The number of males and females with injuries, if we're looking at all injuries combined, are more or less the same. However, if we're just focusing on the distribution of violent trauma by age and sex, we do see a really clear difference, and that there's a concentration of violent trauma in males under 40 years, whereas the violent trauma in females, and there are only 2 cases of violent trauma in females, occurs only in women that were over 40 years, with one of the women being quite old. Overall, violent trauma was present in 12.5% of all males 12 years or older at the time of death, compared to only 3.6% of females. So we're definitely seeing a male bias in patterns of violent trauma. And I'm going to focus on a few of these cases. So perimortem up here, perimortem refers to injuries occurring at or around the time of death, which may or may not be associated with the cause of death. So I have 2 examples here, graves 230 and 268. These are both male, and they both exhibit perimortem cranial injuries. So on the left here, we have grave 230. It was a male between 20 and 30 years at the time of death. And he shows a circular blunt force injury on the forehead just left of the midline. And there is a second semicircular perimortem injury on the right parietal bone. So this would be, this circular injury would be about here, and the semicircular injury would be kind of back here on the right. They both have pretty sharp margins, which tells us that no healing had taken place by the time, or at the time of death. So these are perimortem. This injury also has a hinge fracture in the center here, where a piece of bone is kind of only partially broken and pushed in, and that's another indicator of a perimortem injury. And if we were to flip the skull over and then zoom into this area on the inside of the skull, we see something interesting happening. Oh, pardon me. The smooth outer cortical bone on the inside of the skull had been dislodged as a result of the force of impact of the blow, and it revealed the underlying porous spongy bone. So they're kind of what about a bone plug that would have been dislodged into the cranial cavity as a result of this injury, which probably is what killed this person. However, no trauma outside of the skeleton was seen in this individual. That the trauma in this individual was restricted to the head, and it seems to have been fatal. Here we have the back of the skull of an individual's 15 to 20 years at the time of death, and sex is inferred on the basis of the location of the head and the orientation of the body. So they're a designated probable male. And what we have here is a series of overlapping circular blunt force injuries to the top of the skull. So it would have been kind of about right here. And we have a 6th on the back of the skull. So this is, the top of this is about right here in the picture. So if I just kind of had tilted the skull up, so this would have been a blow to the back of the head. There are 5 overlapping circular wounds in the top of the head, at least 1 circular wound to the back of the head. The area below this was unfortunately damaged, so I couldn't assess if there were further injuries. If we look at the detail of this injury to the far left, we see that it's incomplete. It didn't fully penetrate the skull, that the bone is still intact, and you can see the outline, the perimeter of the injury here. What else is really interesting are these 2 cut marks. There's a deep cut mark, a deep incision running through the center of the injury, and there's a second deep incision on the bottom margin of the injury. And this suggests possible surgical intervention that involved cutting away and removing either the damaged tissue and even some of the bone around the injury. And the clear margins, not only on the fractures, but on these cuts, indicate that these were made either right before or right after the individual had died. And the final thing I want to point out about these two cases is if we look at the diameter of the wounds, this circular wound is kind of just under about 3 by 3 centimeters. This one is close to 3.5 centimeters diameter. They match almost perfectly two stone axes found in Marosh graves and from Marosh settlements. So in these cases, I feel fairly confident in saying that this was the type of weapon used to produce these injuries that we see in these two cases. I want to look at a third case. This is another male. Unfortunately, the postcranial skeleton, the part of the skeleton below the skull, was missing. So I could not determine age other than that this was an adult individual. And this person shows a perimortem cleft wound to the right kind of top of the head, so about right here. And it's, if we look at a detail of the injury, we see a wide V-shaped cleft with the surface bone pushed into the entry site with a clean exit site with no fracturing. And this injury was likely caused by a downward hacking force with an implement like a cleaver or an axe. And it looks very similar to this type of stone axe that has also been recovered from Marosh cemeteries and Marosh settlements. So they seem to have a preference for using stone axes in combat, and we find in human remains injuries consistent with the two types of stone axes, at least that I am familiar with, that have been recovered from excavations of Marosh settlements and cemeteries in this part of Serbia. So here we have all of the grave numbers, the associated sex and age at death of individuals with trauma that is consistent with violent trauma. And here are their offerings, the grave offerings that were placed with the bodies. And the offerings in bold are offerings that are considered to be high status items. So high status items they're based on either what they're made out of exotic materials, or the skill required to make them, such as a Baroque cup up here would require more skill than would be required to make a simple ceramic cup. So the numbers in red are the percentage of individuals with trauma, and the numbers in blue are the kind of total for the cemetery. So 71% of individuals in the cemetery have offerings, and 100% of individuals with signs of violent trauma were buried with at least one grave good. If we look at high status or prestige goods, the relationship is even more striking. Whereas only 25% of graves include one or more of these items in bold here, over half or 2/3 of graves of individuals with violent trauma show this. And it may be more because the 131, this grave was destroyed. And so if there were things that the individual was buried with, they were probably removed at some time in the past. If we look at metal items, half of the people with trauma are buried with copper or bronze object or implement, compared to only 19% of the total cemetery population. So what this pattern is showing us is it's supporting a connection between youth, masculinity, violence, and status, at least in death. So women were rarely victims of interpersonal violence, and those that were included older females, with only one case of deadly violence against an older woman. The young age of male victims of violence and their treatment and death demonstrates that for some men, status was cultivated through fighting. It may be that their unusual manner of death elicited special types of funerary treatments or intervention. And so I argue here that how they died reflects who they were and how they lived, which in turn put them at an increased risk of dying young. And this pattern supports an emerging warrior identity in the Maros region at the end of the early Bronze Age and the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age. And the last thing I want to talk about is diet and what diet can tell us about these interactions between gender, social status, and how people lived. So another way to use bones to reconstruct behavior is by through chemical analysis. And I performed a type of chemical analysis that looked at collagen, and bone collagen is the protein or organic component of bone. And I focused on stable isotopes of carbon and nitrogen in a sample of adults from Ostojevo. And I compared the carbon and nitrogen stable isotope signatures in the human bones to animal bones from several Maros sites from Serbia and in Hungary. And while values of these carbon and nitrogen stable isotopes vary regionally, in general for nitrogen, the higher an animal is on the food chain, the more enriched they will be in the heavier nitrogen 15 isotope. So soil and plants are usually, and we measure these in parts per mil. So this is what this symbol means, parts per mil. So soil and plants are usually 0 to 3 parts per mil. Um, the addition of fertilizers like manure can increase the values of plants up to about 5 parts per mil. Herbivores, which subsist entirely on plants, generally have nitrogen values that are 4 to 6 parts per mil. And fish and carnivores are usually between 9 and 12 parts per mil. So omnivores, like humans, pigs, and dogs, their nitrogen signatures will vary depending on how much protein they consume from plants versus how much protein they consume from animals that live on land versus aquatic resources. So the kind of values of omnivores are going to vary based on where they're getting most of their protein. For carbon, there is a moderate trophic level effect. However, when we look at the values of the carbon stable isotopes, different plants can have higher or lower values depending on how they use sunlight to make food. So what type of photosynthesis or photosynthetic pathway they use. In the old world, meaning Europe, Africa, and Asia, the majority of wild plants and domestic crops are designated C3 plants, and they have carbon values that range between -20 to -35 parts per mil. So wheat, barley, lentils, and peas, which were cultivated and consumed by the Maros, are going to fall in this range. The only known C4 plant cultivated in Europe in the Bronze Age was millet. And C4 plants, they have more enriched carbon values, so they are going to be less negative than C3 plants. There's no evidence that millet was cultivated or consumed in large quantities by the Maros. So kind of what we're expecting is that most of the humans and their animals and their carbon values are probably going to fall around here because they're eating C3 plants. So here we have, these are the carbon values on the x-axis, the nitrogen values on the y-axis. The red are the female values and the blue are the male values. And I have them separated by age. So the solid lines are males and females dying between 18 and 40 years. And the dotted lines are males and females dying older than 40 years. Uh, there's no difference in, if we're looking at nitrogen values, there's no difference in nitrogen values among males based on age. And we see here that um, at least older females are plotting with both younger and older males. However, what's interesting are the females dying at a relatively younger age, and that they have these lower or more depleted nitrogen values relative to older females and younger and older males. And this relationship is significant. So if we're looking at young females versus young females have statistically significantly lower nitrogen values than young males. Um, and young females also have statistically significantly lower nitrogen values compared to older females. So it does seem that younger females are eating different types of food, are probably consuming less animal protein and more plant protein than older women and young and older men. So when we compare these values with animals, and same here, so down here we have the carbon values, here are the nitrogen values. Looking specifically at nitrogen, the higher we go, the higher an animal or a human is on the food chain. So herbivores like sheep, deer, and cattle, they plot between about 6 and 8.5 parts per mil for their nitrogen values. Omnivores like pigs and dogs are between about 7.7 and 10.2 parts per mil. The average male and female nitrogen levels, there's females are a little bit lower than males on average, but the difference isn't significant. However, there is a subset of young adult, low status females that, at least for nitrogen, are plotting with the dogs and the pigs. And that this is an indicator that these women may have been subsisting on what they could forage and on table scraps. Whereas the older women and the males, they have the higher nitrogen values. So what this means is that males and older women have preferential access to nutritious foods, especially meat. Young women, and you can see some of these, this is a female outlier here, these female outliers down here with the carbon values. Young women also seem to be eating a lot of different types of foods, whereas men tended to be eating more of the same thing. Um, and this is possibly due to these younger women needing to supplement their diet with types of foods that people might otherwise avoid or eat in smaller quantities. So, in terms of the social significance of these results, this pattern supports young women possibly sacrificing their food security to provision males and older women. And cross-cultural comparisons of childcare practices shows that mothers and female relatives, such as older siblings, overwhelmingly are responsible for feeding and caring for young children and dependent infants. This can mean that there's considerable social pressure placed on adolescent and younger reproductive aged women to forego eating nutritional foods so that these types of foods are available for the elders, men, children, and older siblings. And I propose in my research this combination of a gender and age bias in provisioning, coupled with young women needing to supplement their diet, possibly by eating plants that they gathered, supports the population buried at Ostrojevo experiencing a degree of food insecurity, and that this food insecurity in turn influenced cultural practices of food sharing that followed ideas of gender and age norms. And this pattern is something that has not been documented in stable isotopic studies of diet for earlier Neolithic or Copper Age set communities in the Pannonian Plain. So this pattern is a deviation from what we see in other prehistoric populations in terms of diet, where we don't really see much of a difference between males and females in diet. So the Ostoyevho population, in terms of the patterns of what they're eating and how they're associated with age and gender, do seem to be unique. And I'm interpreting this as evidence of food insecurity affecting cultural practices. So conclusion, looking at the social context of life, death, diet, and health at Ostoyevho. And I'm going to return to my 3 research questions and talk about, what are the takeaways? How have these questions been addressed through my research? So the first is, how do changes in trade and political organization affect local populations in terms of demography, health, and diet? So the evidence from Ostoyevho supports high infant and child mortality in the late Marosh period. Non-specific stress markers like criborbitalia that indicate chronic illness or malnutrition, especially in the early childhood period, are present in over half of individuals dying before 20 years, with no difference in overall prevalence between males and females. Violent trauma supports escalating conflict at this time, with 17% of adult males exhibiting perimortem or healed injuries consistent with hand-to-hand combat. And dietary evidence shows a pattern of young women going without high-value animal protein foods, likely to provision men, older women, and children. And based on other published paleodietary research from the Carpathian Basin, this pattern is unique for prehistoric groups in this larger region. And demography, disease, trauma, and dietary evidence support a pattern of increasing economic and social insecurity or isolation and insecurity in the Marosh area at the end of the early Bronze Age and during the Middle Bronze Age. The second question, what was the biocultural impact of increasing social complexity and social inequality and violence? And what was the pattern and incidence of violent conflict? At Ostoyevho, we see a pattern of violence that is consistent with violence directed towards individuals, likely in the context of hand-to-hand combat. There's no evidence of groups being targeted. There are no mass graves. All the burials are more or less individual burials. So we don't really see any burial patterns consistent with warfare, with group violence. It's largely individuals. And this violence targets men between 12 and 40 years. Stone axes seem to be the weapon of choice, with blows preferentially targeting the head. And there's no evidence of widespread organized warfare. However, grave offerings indicate a relationship between violence and violent behavior with relations of power and social status, at least in the Marosh community at Ostoyevho. And last but not least, but how did fertility and childcare practices affect patterns of morbidity and mortality in infants, children, adolescents, and young adults? So there's no differences in mortality between males and females before mid-adolescence. However, the highest prevalence of stress markers is in females 3 to 20 years, whereas males 20 to 30 years show the highest prevalence of stress markers. So whereas females seem to be maybe more likely to die as a result of malnutrition and disease as in childhood, ultimately, kind of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And the women that do seem to be surviving to adulthood are on average healthier than the men that survive to adulthood. I don't know what happened to 2, but we'll go for it. Despite the effects of high fertility and poor diet on health and reproductive age women, interestingly, we don't see a corresponding increase in mortality. If you remember back to that probability of death, that the risk of dying in women in their 20s and 30s is actually fairly low, that we don't start to see a sharp increase in mortality in women until we get to their 40s, with quite a few women surviving into their 50s, 60s, or even older into their 70s and even 80s. However, the opposite is true for males, that males show, even though they seem to be getting a better diet, they are showing a sharper rise in mortality in their 20s and 30s. And it's unclear exactly what causes this trend, but it's likely multifactorial and including a higher risk of violent death affecting young adult males, but not affecting young adult females. So that's it. I would like to thank the National Museum of Kikinda, where I did my research, the University of Pittsburgh, and for their support, and for my collaborators who I saw, I think Alicia and Amy, I saw your names on there earlier, so thank you. And now I will open it up to questions and see what we have on the chat.
We have a few in the chat. So somebody asked, why do these individuals have to be 18 to determine their sex?
It has to do with growth patterns in the skeleton, and it has to do with all skeletons looking kind of sexually ambiguous before about 18 years. So once you get to 18 years, you start to have in the bones the formation of what are secondary sexual characteristics. So when we're talking about soft tissue, secondary sexual characteristics are what usually happens around puberty. So developing breasts in women, and men and women developing pubic hair and armpit hair, and men, facial hair. Well, there are secondary sexual characteristics that also affect the bones. And in the pelvis, that has to do with the functional differences between the male and female pelvis associated with childbirth. And that doesn't reach a stage of growth and maturity until around 18 years in both males and females. So generally speaking, there is a tendency for teenage girls, especially around like 16 to 18, to maybe look relatively more masculine in their features, and for teenage boys to look a bit more feminine in their features. So really the only way to determine sex and this is even in forensics, in younger individuals and even in teenagers, is through DNA. I did do a pilot study looking at dental measurements, because you have your permanent teeth, your adult teeth, and your first molar erupts when you're about 6 years old. So children do have adult parts of their skeleton. And there were some differences in that men tended to have larger molars than women. And when we looked at that with the children, we did see this relationship between individuals with larger molars being buried with their heads to the north or the east, so being buried in the male pattern. So I did kind of have some other supplemental evidence other than the location of the head to support using body placement as a way to infer sex in younger individuals.
Yeah, okay. And we also had, are there cultural problems resulting from working with these dead individuals? Is the local community supportive?
Yeah. There's not really any in this area prohibition or superstition about working with human remains. At least when I was working on them, human remains weren't actually considered part of the archaeological record in ways that, say, pottery or other artifacts were. So they actually had in many ways, fewer protection than pots and stone axes. What I will say is that my research was done in the jail cells of what had been the old courthouse in Kikinda in northeastern Serbia, and I would often be working late into the night, and the security guards would change shifts and not realize I was still down there. And so sometimes I would kind of freak the security guards out because they would see lights and hear music and sounds coming from the jail cells where all the bones are stored. So, kept things fun in that respect. But no, there wasn't any, there's not really any cultural prohibitions. I mean, they actually have remains that are on display in the museum from this site and from other sites in the area, and have educational activities and events that are associated with that, and talking about the bioarchaeology and what you can learn about how people lived and they died from studying their bones.
We also had, with the lower number of violent deaths, would that suggest the violence was more personal, one-on-one, as compared to large-scale fighting and warlike violence? You kind of addressed that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's what the pattern supports, is one-on-one violence and encounters. And with that, then it's hard to tell if the violence is coming from outside, in terms of maybe something like a raid or an ambush, or if this is reflective of kind of internal conflicts happening within the community, where we maybe even have homicide between people who know and are possibly even related to one another. If you noticed on the one with the blow to the head on the forehead it was on the forehead on the left and the top of the head on the right, if someone is right-handed and they're coming at you, they're going to hit the left side of their skull. And if they're also right-handed and they're coming at you from the right, they're going to hit the right on the top of the skull. So some of the patterns of violence are consistent with face-to-face combat, with the attacker being right-handed.
Okay. And so I was curious about the depositional history of the cemetery. What are the stratigraphic differences in sex, age, and health markers?
There's not, all the graves are individual burials. They were found, it's a very basic stratigraphy, which makes it easy for interpretation. So I wasn't involved in excavation. I was a toddler when they were excavating the cemetery. And by the time I started working in there in 2011, the Milorad Giric, who had directed the excavations, he had passed away. So I was going off of his records, and also the museum director, Lydia Milashinovic, had done a master's thesis compiling and summarizing the excavations and the burials in terms of the grave offering. So I was relying on that. I did visit the site. It's a cornfield, or at least it was a cornfield when I went and visited it. The graves, in terms of the modern surface, are at a depth of just below the surface down to, I think the deepest was about 1.3 meters. So they're fairly shallow. They were buried in circular pits. And with a few exceptions, like in this grave 66 on the left here, they're almost all single burials, and there's very little overlap. There's nothing that has been found that could be interpreted as a grave marker, but the fact that the burials seem to not overlap with one another, and the cemetery was probably used for several hundred years, shows that there was probably some type of marker that people knew where people were buried, and they probably knew where family members were buried. But they weren't burying people on top of one another. You don't have really any mass grave deposits. They're all single burials. So very simple, single phase stratigraphy.
And we also have, why do you think that the gash mark with the sharp edges is a stone axe wound and not from a metal one?
That's a really good question. I don't, and I think actually in my dissertation I do have either a copper, bronze, or stone axe. I don't have a good picture of one, unfortunately, but they do have copper axes. There weren't any copper or bronze axes found at Stoichkovo as grave goods, but there was a stone mold where they would have poured in the copper to make the axe, and that was in one of the graves, and it was in the grave of a young adolescent male. Unfortunately, the skull had been removed after excavation. I couldn't find it, but the grave records do indicate that there was trauma on the skull. However, in that male, there was extensive injuries to both shoulders that had damaged the growth plates. And when I consulted with my friend who is a radiologist, it was a type of injury that's fairly common in sports that is kind of easy to correct today, but they don't seem to have been able to treat it, which caused the shoulders to be kind of rotated forward. Um, and when I looked into the medical literature, into the clinical literature, because it was odd that it was symmetrical and affecting both shoulders, I found a case of, I think it was a male in his early 20s who was lifting and lifted too much weight, and it pulled him forward and caused this kind of rotational dislocation of both shoulder joints. So in terms of what kind of force caused that, and I know that kind of deviated from the question, but this is the mold for the axe was buried in the grave of a juvenile male who had signs of trauma, and the kind of trauma that you get in like tackle sports like football or wrestling. But yes, the cleft injury could absolutely have been caused by a metal or copper or bronze axe. And what would need to be done would scanning electron micrography and looking at the injury patterns at a microscopic level.
We also have somebody asked if you could expand on the DNA. You said there was a bit of a pilot study, and they're wondering whether it was possible or seemed like it was possible to extract DNA from these skeletal remains.
I know there was a pilot study. I was not involved in that. That was a separate research project by people at I think a European institution. I didn't do any DNA for my work. I just did the bone collagen and looking at the stable isotopes of carbon and nitrogen. I know for that study, I don't think they were successful in extracting DNA from either Ostoyechovo or from remains from the nearby cemetery at Mokrin. I can't remember the citation off the top of my head.
I think, well, when we put this together, we can find it and include that information too, if people are curious.
Yeah, I could send that along.
Yes. And so somebody else asked about your research project, about your research process. Did you know what you were looking for before you started? Like the trauma was probably obvious, but things like sex, age, and class differences, food insecurity wouldn't have been known until after data collection. So how do you know ahead of time what to research when you're writing grants and things like that?
No, that's a really good question. And in many ways, I didn't know what my dissertation was actually about until I sat down to write the conclusion. And I had collected this incredible amount of data and pulled it together. I had these very kind of general questions based on prior research people had done in this area, but a lot of my research was I kind of thought of it as a survey, but instead of surveying an area to look for sites, I was surveying this skeletal collection that had been excavated. We knew what people had been buried with, but we didn't know anything about the people themselves in terms of their age, the demographic distribution, um, any indicators of disease, of stress, of violence. I mean, these were complete unknowns. And there were a couple kind of comparative samples. Well, one from the Smokrin Cemetery, which had been published. There were a couple comparative samples from different time periods in the prehistoric, from northern Hungary, to give me kind of an idea of what was going on. But otherwise, it was a lot of, well, we just don't really know. And there's a need for the systematic documentation of these large skeletal collections, so that people can carry out comparative studies that are looking at kind of more nuanced questions and more theoretically sophisticated questions. So initially, a lot of my research questions were very basic and simple, because I just didn't know. I mean, they had been excavated, and the excavations had ended in 1991. There were the conflicts that broke out in Yugoslavia, and then they were essentially untouched until I went in 2011. I mean, they were boxed with multiple graves boxed together. So part of what I did is box things separately so that you have and to label everything and to organize that. So part of, in the process of doing my research, I also organized and curated the collection and making sure things were labeled and bagged and everything was stored together. Like, for example, the skulls were stored separately from the postcrania. And so I would find the skeleton, below the head, and I would inventory that. And then maybe a year or two later, I would find the skull that was associated with that person, in a different storeroom in the museum. The maps, I just kind of spent one day exploring the museum and storeroom, and I found all the maps, all the excavation maps. So I spent about 12 hours one day just scanning everything and then digitizing everything by hand in ArcGIS. The records, the excavation records, say that there should be slides or photographs. However, I was not able to locate them. And as far as I know, the director was not able to locate them, at least as of 2016, which was the last time I was in Serbia.
We have another question. Any idea why infants and small children were placed in urns, but adults weren't placed in anything?
This Australia was really interesting because it's the only martyr cemetery where you have infants under the age of about 3 that are buried there. At all the other martyr cemeteries, they don't start burying people in the cemetery until they're about 3 or so. And there's even a couple of remains that are probably late fetal remains, even stillbirths. And a lot of the urn burials had no, or at least in the records say they had no recoverable remains, which makes me wonder if these were actually fetal remains of miscarriages that they were burying, and the bones were so fragile that nothing preserved and then nothing was recovered. I mean, why they wouldn't put the adults in them is the adults wouldn't fit. You can fit an infant or a child in these jars. One of the questions, and this would be a question for an archaeologist who would be interested in this material, is how the storage jars the children are placed in compare to what you find in settlements. So are these storage jars that already would have been hanging around and they kind of recycled them as burial containers, or were they made specially for burial? And that's a question I don't know. Not all infants and children under 5 are buried in storage urns. There are some that are just buried in humations, and there's no clear pattern. If I go to the map of the cemetery, I don't have things distinguished between age. I just have the burial numbers, but the urn burials are found throughout the entire cemetery. And so there's no really clear patterning in terms of burial treatment, or you have more infants found in one area and more adults found in another. They're all pretty intermixed with one another. But the fact that they buried everyone, including possible miscarriages and stillbirths, really shows that at least the community that was burying their dead at Ostrojevo had a different view of personhood. And I mean, my opinion is that this view of personhood kind of reflects that they were this society in crisis, that they couldn't maintain their population level, that they were kind of a dying community. So maybe births would have been celebrated in a way that weren't at these earlier Maro sites that were a little bit more stable in terms of their food supply and their general security. I know that's my hypothesis based on my research of why this is happening here, and you have this local tradition that is different than the other Maro cemeteries.
Yeah. So somebody also asked what prompted you to conduct your research. So I think maybe more generally, how did you find this cemetery, this topic?
It was through kind of a channel of people and creating a domino effect that this was brought to my attention. As an undergrad, I had the opportunity to spend 2 summers working on an excavation in North Macedonia, and that's how I got involved working in the Balkans, working in the former Yugoslavia. And then when I was accepted into the program, the anthropology program at the University of Pittsburgh, University of Pittsburgh has a really strong Russian Eastern European studies program. And so I was able to receive, they also offer Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian languages. So I was able to receive funding through FLOS fellowships, foreign language acquisition scholarships. So I was basically being paid to study Serbo-Croatian, Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, but then that also supported my research working in this area. So that's kind of how I got involved working here. And I was interested in bioarchaeology, and my kind of time period was fairly open. And so when I heard about this collection and that it was full of opportunity, I jumped on that. And here I am 10 years later.
All right. Well, I think our last question, and then we'll wrap up, is there temporal patterning to the spatial distribution of the graves?
Kind of. So O'Shea et al. 2019 did radiocarbon dating of Ostrojevo Cemetery. I think they did about eight graves or so. And it does seem that the cemetery developed from east to west. Whether there is any development in terms of like southeast to northwest, there would need to be dates obtained from more graves. That publication also suggests there may have been a hiatus in the cemetery use of about 100 years or so. Now, once again, more dates would need to be obtained to determine whether or not the cemetery fell into complete disuse, or just the rate at which people were being buried was lower, which might reflect, okay, this community moved out of the area, but then they moved back in. And I won't get into it, but there's some other indications in the archaeological record that suggest that might be the case, that this could have been maybe even I don't know if this is inaccurate, but kind of a refugee community from another area in the or another part of this Marosh area that are then moving back in at the very end of the Marosh culture sequence, and they are picking up where they left off. So to answer that, I think there would need to be some type of DNA analysis looking at possible consanguinity between the earlier and later graves. Also more radiocarbon dates to look at the kind of rate of burials over time in the cemetery. I have an entire separate presentation where I did spatial analysis on graves, and there are some patterns, even though it looks like there's just a random distribution of dots. There are some patterns in terms of children tend to be buried close to other children, and children tend to be buried close to women, and women tend to be buried close to children. So there is some suggestion of family relationships being reflected in the burial placement.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Thank you everyone for being here. We hope to see you on November 11th for our next talk by Christian Thomas, who's an archaeologist for the government of the Yukon. And he'll be giving a talk entitled Alpine Ice Patch Archaeology, Preserving the Legacy of a 10,000-Year-Long Relationship Between Animals, Ice, and First Nation Peoples in the Mountains of the Yukon.
All right, and I shared my email. If anyone has other questions, you can feel free to email me at my K-State email. It's kpompeani@ksu.edu.
Okay. Awesome. And once again, thank you so much, everyone. We'll see you.
Yes, thank you everyone for attending.